Hello, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, you can. Great. My name is Alexander Bard, and I'm a philosopher. And the great thing about being a philosopher is that I'm not a scientist. Philosophy is not a science, it's an art form. That means it's much bigger than science. And that means, for example, that I can propose loads of things without having any evidence for them whatsoever. It doesn't really matter at all. Actually, the famous French philosopher Gilles Deleuze once said, "Science deals with solving problems. Philosophy deals with inventing new problems." So, I want to invent new problems, and the more problems there are, the more fun the world is. So, solving the problems is not my responsibility. I happily leave that to science. I'd rather invent new problems you haven't even thought of before. That's what philosophers do. So, I'm very happy being a philosopher. And that's why when I heard today's theme, it's about time, and because I'm a bit of a nerd, I actually took it literally. I decided to give you a short TEDx talk on time, a philosophical talk. What is time? Well, it turns out time is the most everyday thing we could ever think of. And the funny thing in the world of philosophy is that those everyday things we just take for granted but don't really think much about are really the most profound ideas of all and the biggest mysteries we could think of. So I would even say that time is the greatest mystery of all. If I would ask you what time is, you could either come up with some kind of a banal answer like, time is something that clocks measure. No, it isn't. A clock is a measurement tool with which you measure time, but it doesn't really answer the question of what time is at all. It's just a measurement. It's like saying that, a distance is where a car drives if I go from position A to position B. So the car is the distance. No, it isn't. The car is a transportation method to take you from point A to point B. It hasn't really explained what distance is at all. Then if you're a bit more clever and I ask you what time is, you'd probably come up with one of the greatest thinkers of the 20th century, certainly one of the most influential, and he turned out to be a scientist and also a philosopher, and his name was Einstein. And Einstein created this wonderful thing called space-time, upon which we then created modern physics. Space-time is essentially this. We always knew there were 3 dimensions of space. And then Einstein said, what if we just add time to that and turn time into the 4th dimension, and then we can have space-time? And he thought that was wonderful, and it was for mathematics and for physics, because you could suddenly start describing the world in the most intricate ways by putting everything into a position in space-time. And you could basically freeze the world. That was very helpful in the world of physics, but Einstein made a terrible mistake that physicists very often make, or scientists often make. They think they become philosophers, and the terrible news is that philosophers are way smarter than scientists are. So we constantly have to remind these scientists, actually, Einstein, just because you created the mathematics here that made it easy for you to comprehend the world doesn't really prove that you've proven anything. It's not that time isn't a 4th dimension of space. Time is different from space. To begin with, time only goes in one direction. And that's why it's so weird. So a physicist would probably say, well, in the world of physics, time can go backwards and forwards. Yeah, because everything else goes backwards and forwards, because if you take the metaphor of space and then apply it on time and say that time is just the 4th dimension of space, then you start thinking, then time should appear the way space does, because in space you can go backwards and forwards. But you can't. Time only goes in one direction. It's an arrow. Now, Einstein found this very useful to show us that time can be relative. Time can move faster in one spot than it moves in another spot. At least the time that Einstein measured with his clocks. But it still only goes in one direction. It doesn't go backwards. And if anyone in here can prove to me that time in any way whatsoever can move backwards, I would be happy to listen. But I haven't seen any evidence for that whatsoever. The mystery has not been caught yet. So time moves in one relentless direction. And the problem here with Einstein's worldview is that he only talks about local time. He talks about time in a specific part of the universe. For example, the planet Earth and our solar system, and within the solar system, time moves in a certain direction. Here, yeah, it does. And it can then move differently. If you're out in space or if you're on the planet, it can move at different speeds. So you age more in one place than you would age in the other place. So that's correct for local time. But what if there is more than one time? What if there are several dimensions of time rather than just one? The funny thing is that now when you deal with string theory these days, a lot of string theorists are saying, why don't we just add 2 time dimensions rather than 1 dimension of time, since we have so many dimensions anyway in string theory, and suddenly their equations start to make sense. So if we have a local time, we could easily also have a universal time, a time for the universe itself as a whole. And that time did not have to be relative at all. And actually, funnily enough, it's the kind of time we could not measure with the clock, because you cannot put a clock outside of the universe. That's the whole point. You can only measure this kind of time for the universe as a whole, and then you could, for example, say that the universe is 13.8 billion years old. It wouldn't be 13.8 billion years in different places, but it could be that if we measured time as a whole for the entire universe. So, why did Einstein become so popular? It turns out that this is actually a struggle in the world of philosophy and in the world of science that has gone on since the Greeks. And within the Greek community, they had 2 little guys called Parmenides and Heraclitus. And they were like the 2 opposite sides in this struggle. I would say that one of them is the neurotic guy and the other guy is the psychotic guy. Because thinkers are either psychotic or neurotic. Okay, and the personality alters the way they think. You know, Nietzsche once said that there is no way we could think outside of our own psychology. I completely agree with him. We're completely incapable as human beings to think outside of the personality types we are, and that's exactly why philosophers are so different from one another, because they have different personality types. So Parmenides was the neurotic here. He was way before Einstein. He was a nerd. And his idea was this, that, well, at the end of the day, time is an illusion. Yeah, okay. If time is an illusion, then nothing ever changes. Exactly, said Parmenides, nothing ever changes. Any change we would observe is illusional. So everything has happened or is not happening or whatever at the same time. So there's nothing outside of that. So what Parmenides essentially said is that we have a past and we perceive a present, and we perceive or we think we're going to perceive a future eventually, have these 3 aspects of it, and they're all equally valid, they're all equally real, because they're all occurring at the same time. In other words, there is no time at all. And this turned out actually, weirdly enough, to be a very popular idea among the Greeks, especially one guy called Plato, who influenced the rest of history more than any of the other Greeks. He loved Parmenides' idea. He even mentioned Parmenides in several of his books. He even gave one of the titles of his books after Parmenides. And Plato liked this idea, and Plato essentially said that, well, we live in a world that's sort of miserable, dysfunctional, kind of stupid, but it's not the real world. There's another world that is more real than the current world we live in, and it's the world of ideas. And in the world of ideas, we would see that time is an illusion. Now, Heraclitus was the opponent of these guys, and he was a psychotic, so he didn't write that much. He was kind of the lazy guy, you know, because the problem with the neurotic guys is they write a lot of books. And they're very patriarchal, so people are forced to listen to them more or less. Heraclitus, we only have a few little remnants left, and Heraclitus was the guy who said the famous quote, "You cannot put the same foot in a river twice." What he meant was that time is change. And change is occurring all the time. Every single moment is a moment of change. Interestingly enough, there are always these clever students around philosophers. And Heraclitus had one of these students. And Heraclitus said, you can never put the same foot in the river twice. One of his clever students said, it's not even the same river. The point here is that change is moving on all the time. And the only thing that really exists are occasions. And every occasion that exists is totally unique. That means there's never 2 of anything. Everything that ever happens is completely unique. So from one moment to the next, the entire universe has changed dramatically. And the question is then, why then did this idea that Parmenides presented, the time as an illusion, become so attractive to us? Well, it has to do with the fact that we could not orient ourselves in a world with so much dramatic change as it actually is. We cannot find our way through the world at all if we actually would observe all the changes that was going on. Because our perception, our senses are reached by so much change at any given moment that if your brain was preoccupied with processing 1 second of perceptions and process them all, it would take it 25,000 years to do that. So what the brain cleverly does is that it takes in the perceptions and immediately sorts out anything that it can sort out and say, okay, we can just put this into norms or into models or anything we used before or biographies or whatever. And we have these different piles. We can put this stuff so I can focus on what's important for me in what is changing from one given moment to the next. And in the world of philosophy, we call these eternalizations. Simply because what we do is that we take in something which is moving and changing from one moment to the next, and then we freeze it as if we then observed something, and by observing that, it can no longer change. Your own ego is a perfect example of such an eternalization. Actually, at any given second, all the different potentialities you would have, all the different things your body could do the next second, all of those things that your body does not do are a dead version of you. And only that thing your body actually does is the only thing that survives from 1 second to the next. So your sense of an ego is just your brain constructing this idea that there is a timeline from the time you were born until today when you meet here with me at TEDx at Handelshögskolan. So between these 2 points, there's a timeline, and then your brain afterwards constructs this idea that there is something eternal inside of you that's always the same, that occurred when you were born and is still the same today. But this is the real illusion. There is no such thing. It was your parents yelling at you when you were a kid, going after, saying that, "You there, what are you doing?" Eventually you internalized that, and you were probably about 1 year old. You started saying, I, about things this body were doing. So you started taking responsibility for the things your body does. And then when you're 18 years old, you take loads of selfies all the time, and you put them on Instagram, and you're just waiting for somebody to look at you so you finally get some fucking attention. That's your ego, okay? But the ego is an illusion. There's no such thing. But of course, these guys, Plato and Parmenides, the neurotic guys, they have huge egos. They don't like this. So they like to defend their ego. And the way to defend their ego is by insisting that time is an illusion. And that becomes a very popular idea. For example, we then have a society where we have churches that preaches truth every Sunday, and we have a nobility that own land, and we have to work for them as slaves, as peasants. And then we have monarchs who are symbolic creatures, and they're in contact with the gods. And these guys rule the world for us, and eventually we replace them. We replace them with politicians, we replace them with university professors, and we replace them with industry owners. So we've all worked in the service of these patriarchs for the past 2,000 years, and they have every interest in the world in making us believe they have an ego, because if they make us believe we have an ego, we have something to be responsible for. And then they can take us to court. And then they can say, if you don't follow the law, we lock you up because you're responsible for your actions, as if there was a you inside of us that was permanent and never changed. So it serves power. So Heraclitus is what we call a minoritarian thinker. He's at the margins of things. We try to ignore him because nobody out there can really see need for Heraclitus, because you cannot construct a power structure based on Heraclitus, even if the guy turns out to be right. So we move on, and we come to modern times. The thing is that after Plato, we got the Plato of modernity. His name was Kant. Kant was another one of these sort of neurotic guys. He lived in a German town called Königsberg. He never even left Königsberg his entire life. He spent his entire life writing these thick books on discourse, and this is how the world works, and essentially he was the philosopher who created modernity. We live in the shades or shadows of Kant ever since. And Kant was another Platonist. He also claimed that time is an illusion, and it's just something that the brain makes up. It's a form. It's something that the time Time is something the brain makes up to then make sense of sensory experience. But there's no time outside of us. Okay, no time outside of us? As if there wasn't a time before human beings existed? As if there wasn't 13.8 billion years? Kind of weird, huh? So we move on to Kant, and it turns out that Einstein, despite all the formidable work he did with special relativity and general relativity, he really believed in Kant and really believed in Plato. And he's, of course, another one of these neurotic guys. Yeah, he worked in the postal service in Switzerland. What the fuck do you think, you know? So we have these guys here. The question is then, is there an alternative? What happened to Heraclitus and the heritage after Heraclitus? What could we do after him? Well, it turns out there's a funny way of then approaching this, and that's a guy who occurred in the 19th century called Darwin. And Darwin came along with the idea of evolution. Like everything changes over time, and it transforms from one thing into something completely different. And the funny thing with Darwin is that that requires that time is real. And the idea of evolution has now become as popular as Einstein's metaphysics, so these two guys are now struggling it out. And then the funny thing comes in. Behind Einstein's back in the 1920s, there's a whole new part of physics called quantum physics. Have you heard of that? Okay. In quantum physics, there was a Danish guy called Niels Bohr, and in the 1930s, he was one of those guys who started talking to Einstein and saying, Einstein, you're actually fundamentally wrong. You don't get the lesson from quantum physics. Because if time is an illusion, then everything is determined, and that means that everything that's ever happened was pre-programmed inside the Big Bang. It wasn't. The Big Bang happened first. Out of the Big Bang came physics. Out of physics, we got chemistry. Chemistry was not pre-programmed inside physics. It just suddenly happened. And out of chemistry, we got something called biology on this planet here. Biology was not pre-programmed inside chemistry. It suddenly just emerged. And out of biology, we had something called consciousness. And we human beings are now 7 billion people walking around this planet with consciousness in our brains. That was not pre-programmed in the Big Bang. That means the future is not determined. The future is indeterministic. There are chances happening all the time, and that means time must be incredibly real. Einstein is wrong, and Heraclitus was right all along. This brings us down to, was there anybody before Heraclitus who got this? Yeah, there was. In Iran, 3,700 years ago, we find a spooky little sect called the Zervanites. The Zervanites were hated by all the other religions. Everybody else thought the Zervanites were really crazy. The Zervanites worshipped a god called Zervan. And Zervan, I'll teach you, is ancient Persian for time. They believe that time is God himself. And you know what? Looking at the entire history of time, over the last 3,700 years, I think these guys in Iran got it right. Because if there's anything we haven't solved yet, all you atheists out there, if there's any religion I'd be really scared of if I was an atheist today, is for somebody who come along and say that, wait a second, what if time and God is the same time? Or, since we've had these four singularities, the Big Bang, chemistry, biology, and consciousness, maybe a fifth singularity would suddenly happen. And if something as striking as these other things would suddenly just happen from out of nowhere, we have no other word for that thing to happen except the word God. Thank you.